We are live tonight. This is Standing for Truth coming to you. We've got a debate between myself and Snake was right. We're going to have fun. I'm sorry we're a little bit late, but it's all going to be worth it. I promise you. I've got Raw Matt here who's going to moderate for us. So I'm going to hand it over to Matt. Go ahead, Matt.
All right. Hey, everybody. So, yeah, I'm Raw Matt. I'm going to be moderating this. I'm going to do my best. It's the first time that I have. So I'll be writing down questions that are coming in the comments section the best I can. If they're retarded, I'm probably not going to. And as first, we're going to be talking about, I'm going to introduce Standing for Truth as representing the young earth creationist side. And then Snake was right, representing the evolutionary model. We're going to have a 12-minute opening for each person. We have a 10-minute rebuttal for each person. We have an 8-minute total cross-examination, so that's 4 minutes for each person, and a 5-minute closing. And then we'll leave 10-minute Q&A for the very end. So if anybody has anything that they really want to say, just highlight it, message me directly. I'm under knowledge in the comment section. And we'll go from there. So if we're ready to go, I guess Standing for Truth, I believe that you're going to go first if you want to make your opening statement, and I will get the timer going.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Matt. I'm just going to share screen here first and make sure that it's being presented to everybody. Can you see it okay there, Matt?
Origins. Yes.
Okay, perfect. So you can start the timer now. So thanks so much, Snake, for joining me in this second formal debate. The first one was on Modern Day Debates channel. Origins debate, biblical creation versus atheistic evolution. Willingly ignorant, because I think it's most obvious and evident and intuitive that if you are walking through the woods and find an arrowhead, it's really nothing more than rock. It's normal, natural material. It's been shaped and designed for a purpose. And so the only logical and rational conclusion from everybody is that somebody made this, and it could not happen from abrasion or erosion or any other natural process, since this rock was handled and shaped through design. There was obviously someone or something that shaped this arrowhead into its configuration. And empirical science points us to a time consisting of the creation of matter and energy. We're looking at design here, as well as a time of creation or a moment of least entropy. The first law points us to the necessity of a creator outside of creation. And the second law points us directly to creation itself. In the Bible, since I'm defending a biblical creation model, a moment of least entropy is fully described in Genesis 1. Applied to the whole universe, this is a fundamental contradiction to the chaos to cosmos, all by itself, doctrine of atheism and evolution. But the question is, who is this designer, and what model best explains the empirical data? What is the origin of species? And that's what this entire debate is about. Absolute proof for biblical creation. Empirical evidence suggests that everything, including all life, is subject to entropic decay. That is why the biblical-based model, the Bible, a literal interpretation of Genesis, makes best of the evidence of design around us. The evidence of entropic decay strongly indicates three very important things. The fall, as recorded in Genesis, was 100% real. Creation and the fall had to be quite recent. Prior to this genetic degeneration, Adam and Eve would have had zero mutations. The absolute reality of genetic entropy means that good-to-you evolution is going the wrong way. Things are degrading. Things are not being taken forward. We observe devolution and not evolution. Looking backward, the sad reality of genetic entropy demands a literal Adam, a literal Eve, and a literal fall. Once again, genetics confirms biblical creation. Modern genetics has discovered Adam and Eve, Noah's flood, the Tower of Babel, and it's written in the human genome. Mitochondrial Eve. All people have mitochondrial DNA, and this DNA is inherited exclusively from mother to child. This makes the historical analysis of this maternally inherited chromosome very straightforward. It is widely known that all the human mitochondrial DNA in the world are nearly identical and trace back to a single woman who has been called Mitochondrial Eve. Mitochondrial Eve is very literally the mother of us all. The small number of mutations that separate modern people from the sequence of mitochondrial Eve indicates that mitochondrial Eve lived in the recent past. Of course, evolutionists have rescue devices. We'll touch on that later. Y chromosome Adam. The small number of mutations that separate modern men from the sequence of Y chromosome Adam indicates that this man lived in the relatively recent past. Based upon the actual observed mutation rate for the human Y chromosome, studies show that Y chromosome Adam lived just thousands of years ago. These findings are strong evidence supporting the literal Adam of the Bible. The terms Y chromosome Adam and mitochondrial Eve were coined by leading evolutionists. Little did they realize that the history of these two special chromosomes would independently provide strong evidence supporting both a literal Adam and also a literal Eve, who lived in the same time frame, just thousands of years ago. Let's look to low genetic diversity. Over deep time, any large population will accumulate enormous numbers of mutations, resulting in enormous amounts of genetic diversity, of course. This is a serious problem for evolutionary theory because it is now clear that mankind has very limited genetic variation. While the observed low genetic diversity is a massive problem from the evolutionary perspective, this is most certainly expected and predicted from a biblical perspective, of course. From the biblical model, we all come from just two people. This obviously means that limited diversity is easy to explain. However, from an evolutionary perspective, under an evolutionary assumption, our limited human genetic diversity requires a near extinction event immediately preceding modern man's sudden emergence and his rapid conquest of the planet. This near extinction is thought to have occurred around 70,000 years ago, extremely recently by evolutionary standards, immediately before the divergence of the different people groups. Now, during the evolutionary time frame, mutation would have produced a lot of genetic diversity. Evolutionists has always resort to a rescue device by explaining the lack of diversity through a necessary population bottleneck in their story of human history. There's a lot of storytelling going on. But such a near extinction would not just reduce homogeneity, it would cause permanent and severe genetic damage. Enormous numbers of deleterious mutations would go to fixation. How could such a tiny, nearly extinct, genetically compromised population suddenly explode into all parts of the planet, seizing dominion over the world? The evolutionary story is dead. This rescue device of an evolutionary bottleneck hypothesis is not even remotely feasible or empirical. This rescue device involves an extended near extinction event associated with severe inbreeding. Based on the evolutionary perspective and the evolutionary worldview, human genetic homogeneity remains a very serious theoretical problem. However, from a biblical perspective, of course, and a biblical-based model, there's absolutely no problem with the evidence seen in these human populations. According to the biblical-based model, we start with just two people, Adam and Eve, and then 10 generations later, a second single-generation bottleneck of just 8 people occurred at the time of Noah. Both bottlenecks were very brief. Just one generation, and were followed by explosive growth. And in both cases, there would be almost no previously accumulated mutations, hence no inbreeding effects. Very limited genetic diversity is a huge problem for evolutionary theory and leads to unrestrained storytelling. The evolution story needs to be revised almost annually. Yet limited human genetic diversity is very obviously compatible with the biblical perspective and does not require any far-fetched mental inventions. Bottom line here, evolutionists love stories and biblical creationists love the empirical facts. All of this evidence is too close for comfort for evolutionists. Low genetic diversity, one male ancestor, one Y chromosomal ancestor, one mitochondrial DNA ancestor. Most genes comes in 2 versions. Now, more to do with genetics that confirms biblical creation, because we look to the LMN haplogroups, the 3 major haplogroups, and the history of humanity is in our genome. What we know about mitochondrial DNA of humans fits the biblical-based model. The model explains the 3 haplogroups and the relative differences between pre- and post-flood humanity. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited, as I've said before, from mothers. There were 3 young women, married women on the ark, who would have repopulated the earth after the flood 4,500 years ago. The fact that there are 3 major haplogroups of human mitochondrial DNA in the world is amazing confirmation of this model. Also very consistent is the Babel dispersion, where one would expect sudden formation of several variants in human mitochondrial DNA due to rapid separation and isolation of various groups of people. On this tree and map of humanity, the three major haplogroups are joined by relatively short line segments, indicating that there is not much difference between them. This is consistent with the pre-flood world of only 10 generations long ages, being that there are little differences between them. These women came from a world where only a few generations had lived before them. And from these three major nodes emit dozens of mitochondrial DNA variants, each at a relatively greater distance than the three major haplogroups. Obviously, since Babel, there have been many generations accounting for the relatively larger distances between the dozens of mitochondrial DNA variants we see today and the three major haplogroups from which they emerged. This is incredible and irrefutable. So in a nutshell, short lines equal pre-flood times, long lines equal post-flood times. What about the subnodes? Well, this model makes testable predictions. If we come from these three nodes and the DNA differences are all a marker of time, what we are looking at here with the radiating out from the three nodes are post-flood times or the history of civilization. We should be able to read the history of civilization from this tree. Romans, Greeks, Persians, tips are individuals, as I've said. Amazing work is currently being done on the transatlantic slave trade. Also, testable predictions have been made on the most divergent of African peoples, the Khoisan peoples. It's all about testable, falsifiable predictions. Can evolutionists make testable predictions on this map of humanity? How much more time do I have there, Matt?
You're good. You have 3 minutes.
Awesome. Evolutionists reject objections, of course, and it's all about the testable predictions as shown that flow from the placement of the root. And the tree, this phylogenetic tree, is rooted on the L node. Now, icing on the cake for the biblical creation model, orphan genes. Orphan genes are fully functional gene sequences that code for both a functional messenger RNA and a protein. They lack similar counterparts in other organisms. Orphan genes that are specific to humans are powerful evidence against the idea that we evolved from apes. This is because these genes appear fully formed, uniquely integrated into the complexity of the human genomic network, and clearly functional, important to various cellular processes. There is no evidence for common ancestry with apes or any other creatures. Genetics, as I've demonstrated here, once again, supports a biblical-based model. This amazing category of genes are taxonomically restricted genes that are unique to each type of organism, and these genes appear suddenly without any trace of ancestry in apes or any other animal. They don't fit the hypothetical fairy tale of evolutionary theory. Orphan genes are evidently part of the genomic landscape that is indicative of each created kind. The explanation of orphan genes fits the biblical model of created kinds. The orphan genes are especially needed for the uniqueness associated with each created kind as described in the book of Genesis. And this is important given our model of created heterozygosity, that God encoded Adam and Eve and the created kinds with pre-existing functional DNA differences. That would be the model of created heterozygosity. More icing on the cake. Y chromosome DNA disproves human evolution. The extensively and remarkably different DNA sequence of the Y chromosomes between human and chimp presents a very serious problem for common ancestry. Given the low level of recombination in DNA sequence, diversity on the Y chromosome, the human evolution paradigm encounters a fatal blow and a serious problem. This problem is that the human and chimp Y chromosomes should be considerably more similar to each other. If human evolution was true, they should be the most similar chromosomes in the genome because they are so stable, small amount of variation. So evolutionists are going to have to explain away this data. They're going to have to make the model fit their basic assumptions, because all of genetics demonstrates the truth of a literal interpretation of Genesis. And actually, it's a double whammy. It also disproves the theory of pond scum to people evolution, because Snake here, he's going to have to explain how evolution, that pond scum to people type of evolution, has to explain how the four-dimensional genome with multiple overlapping codes and chock full of meta information came about. How much more time do I have there, Matt?
Time right now.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much.
Sure. All right, Snake, whenever you're good. He's on mute. If you can hear me, you're on mute.
Sorry, I'm just getting my screen share up.
Ah, no problem.
Is that working?
Yes, I see it.
All right.
I'll tell you in 1 minute. Till.
Ready?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So He just said that I'm going to have to show how the four-dimensional DNA code, chock full of information, et cetera, has come about. And I actually don't at all. That's not the question of evolution. And it's not the question of the origin of species either. That would be the question of abiogenesis. How the first cellular mechanisms in life came about, that would be the question of abiogenesis. So, what is actual evolution? Well, everyone agrees that certain kinds of animals will differentiate, and we can draw similarities between these animals. Nobody, not even young Earth creationists, deny the relationship between all of the cats. So the real definition of evolution is just the change of populations through the generations. And the classic Aaron Ra example of saying, what does he say? Inherent modification with descent. That's what my textbooks all say. And that's all evolution is. It's just the ability, we all understand the ability of these organisms to differentiate themselves. Now, the young Earth creationists don't really have anything to add to this subject, so they just insert their God in the gap of the scientific knowledge. They essentially just want to piggyback on the actual hard work of real scientists. And that is why the young Earth creationist model is seen as the flat Earth of the life sciences. So essentially, what the creationists will try to do is strawman evolution over and over, say that it's abiogenesis, that evolution needs to explain how the first cellular models came about. If that's what you want to talk about, that's a different debate. But if we're going to talk about the origin of speciation, well, we already assume a living organism. And the theory of evolution never posits that there's any type of organism that produces an organism that's fundamentally different from itself. Evolution states that every organism gives birth to an organism that is similar to it. But we all understand how changes can create diverging lines of these populations. Now, I've gone over a lot of these mutations that contribute to steps in evolution. And the creationists find these unconvincing because they go on and on about how the gene code is deteriorating, and we can get into that, but it seems right now I'm just going to focus on what is the best evidence of a universal common descent, but that's really not the heart of the matter, because we're really debating what is the origin of species. I think that question is already answered. The creationists already understand how new species of finches can arise. They understand how new species of cats can arise from a common ancestor of cat. That debate's over. That's evolution. We all understand that. The creationists just assume an artificial boundary where the kinds cannot further diversify. It's similar to accepting paternity tests, but not accepting the same exact kind of test for more distant relationships. In fact, your research includes studies on Neanderthal DNA introgressing into human DNA. And it's curious that you accept comparative anatomy and comparative genetics when we're talking about sensing Neanderthal DNA in the human genome, even though we've never seen a Neanderthal mate with a human. It was never observed, and yet creationists accept that this happened based on similar genes. But they don't accept just going back even a couple more branches down the line. So the fossil record is essentially a crime scene, and we're trying to reconstruct what happened. And in a lot of crime scenes, you don't have a recording of what actually happened. You just have the evidence. It so happens that we actually do have a camera recording what happened to our Earth's history. Can I ask how much time I have left? Is anyone there?
Yeah, sorry, I was muted. You have
Okay.
6 minutes.
Okay. So again, we actually don't have to piece together what happened purely through inference, although we can make connections through the molecular science that we've done connected with the micro changes that creationists accept. We can observe these macro changes occurring in the fossil record with a literal camera that has recorded this. And the camera is the film is the rocks. And this camera takes about one shot per couple million years. Obviously, we would want a better camera, but this is capturing data all the same. The one reason why people immediately dismiss the young Earth creationist model is because we've dated rocks that are inconceivably older than the absolute oldest predictions of the young Earth creationists. So if they were actually able to make predictions, they would be able to predict the radioactive decay to their model, and they would be able to explain why what we see from the radioactive decay, and what we see is that the Earth is billions of years old. Now we can go over the precise ways that we use radiometric dating, but it is incredibly precise, and I'm not sure how you can possibly challenge that. Now they offer all sorts of rescue devices such as hydrological sorting, which somehow is supposed to organize all the rock layers and solidify all the rock layers within a couple of months and organize them by type of creature. And this would be like expecting to see different flavors of Kool-Aid to just naturally separate themselves out for no reason. Instead, what we actually see is different biomes actually together. So either the flood is mixing everything together or it's piling it up by geography. And we simply don't see any pattern that would indicate geography. And we don't see any pattern of sorting by density because there are the creatures that swim in the ocean are pretty much neutral density in the water, and they're found in every layer. And we also see different densities of layers repeating in the fossil or in the rock layers, which does not happen when you allow sediments to self-organize by density, because this happens over millions of years, not over short periods of time. Now, even professional creationists have a hard time explaining why we only find humans at the top layers. And they try and come up with strange explanations like that they were somehow in the middle, far inland, but there are animals that are far inland that are supposedly extinct, but there are several layers down. So none of their mapping really makes sense. And a violent flood will not create any type of organization. In chemistry and in I'm more fluent in chemistry, but I understand flood geology is the same way in that water acts as a solute. So basically what happens is it mixes everything up into a homogeneous solution. There's no kind of sorting going on there. The final point I would like to drive home in my final minutes is that creationists do accept relation between creatures based on their forms. They accept that these forms can diversify by genetic processes. They accept that we can compare the fossil dolphins that are 20 million years old to modern dolphins, even though we've never seen them have a continuous breeding population. But they admit, excuse me, they admit that this is possible to say that they are the same creature based on comparative anatomy. But when things like this, with bridging the gap between the more whale-like skeletons with the more terrestrial-like skeletons in the whale lineage, the creationists arbitrarily deny comparative anatomy, even though these two fossils have the exact same anatomical features. At least according to the standards that creationists use. The anatomy is slightly different, but they have the same analogous features. Same with the fully terrestrial and fully aquatic versions. They have the same skulls. And it's not just about picking and choosing one little feature and saying, well, they all have the same skull, or they all have the same teeth. That would be like saying, well, they all have spots, therefore they're related.
1 minute.
The thing here is their entire body plan remains consistent with only small incremental changes. So their skull remains consistent, their spine, everything, the number of bones in their hands remains consistent, just the size and perhaps rigidity of the fingers changes. So the skip between a foot and a flipper is actually incredibly low. So if you can't figure out what kind of animal belongs to which kind, you've just proven that links between kinds can exist, because you're demonstrating that there is no limit, that it's a gray area, that the features blend into each other. And this was all predicted by the original evolutionary theory. And I think I can end there.
Time. Perfect. Good job. Great, guys. So the next one will be now your 10-minute rebuttal for each other. It looks like for you, Snake, that he was talking on mtDNA Eve and Y chromosomal Adam with low genetic diversity. He also covered the 3 haplogroups and genetic orphan genes. And you, standing for truth, is for your rebuttal, it looks like he was covering descent within modification explanations, and that's his theory, with on why we have artificial boundaries preventing evolution from occurring, why there's Neanderthal DNA in humans, and why there's the fossil record layers with flood layers. Give an example on why on your model on that, and also explain homologous relationships and defined links between what a kind is, and why he was saying that he can prove that a kind isn't a very good example for us to use, because he can show that there's a diversity between these different kinds, which proves his model. So I hope I clarified that all right. I just took brief notes. And standing for truth, you are up for 10 minutes.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. I appreciate that opening statement there, Taylor. Let's get right into it. When it comes to the animal fossils and the sorting, I mean, we don't just look to body density. We look to habitat, intelligence, ecosystem, mobility, and of course, body density. But the density differences of animals in different rock layers are consistent with our model. Shallow marine creatures will be lighter than deep sea creatures, for example. So shallow marine creatures buried first, then deep sea creatures. And lighter creatures easier to move, so obviously buried first, and heavier creatures harder to move, so buried next. And also, I noticed you talked about the radiometric dating techniques, and at the end of the day, those are based on 3 major assumptions, right? The rate of radioactive decay is known and has been constant since the rock formed, and there has been no loss or gain of the parent or daughter isotopes from the rock, and the amounts of parent and daughter isotopes present when the rock formed are known. So based on these assumptions, when you assume too much, then you're guessing, and these guesses are going to be based on a false assumption. This takes away the reliability of the data. And I noticed at the end there you talked about the whale evolution, and at the end of the day, many complex adaptations are going to be needed to arise to, say, convert a land mammal to a fully aquatic whale. And just a couple of these changes would include the modification of the eye for underwater vision, forelimbs transformed into flippers, emergence of the blowhole, obviously, with musculature and nerve control, as well as even a change in the birthing process where the fetus is delivered in a breech position for labor underwater. So there's going to have to be some massive changes, very complex adaptations, and even in the evolutionary time frame of say the land mammal to whale, there's just not enough time for that amount of novel information to arise. And Neanderthals are proven to be human, fully human, susceptible to genetic degeneration. We know that they were 40% less fit than modern humans. They were an inbreeding population and probably went extinction due to mutation accumulation. And at the end of the day, there was a lot of imagining going on. For example, he talked a lot about the ability to change, differentiation, and how we agree on the definition of evolution, which I would say is a change in allele frequency and in populations over time. But at the end of the day, evolutionists like Snake here, they imagine that mutations are actually going to make something new and better, and he brought up mutations in his opening statement there. So at the end of the day, it comes down to what's observable science, and it's science to say that dogs produce dogs, whales produce whales, but it's not science to say that dogs, whales, bacteria, and pine trees are related through common ancestry. We're going to have to see empirical evidence for that. So you change an allele frequency all you want. Evolutionists are just imagining that all these small scale variations are eventually going to add up to make something we don't actually observe. And that's why time is the hero for the evolutionists, because that type of micro evolutionary variation that Snake's talking about, where you get the change in the frequency of the expression of different traits, I'm not disputing that. Because that type of evolution, obviously, I've said it many times, it explains the survival of the fittest, but at the end of the day, it doesn't explain the arrival of the fittest. That small scale variation, sure, but not the major innovations and the major new forms of life. Because mutations and natural selection, which obviously we agree are the mechanisms driving this change, they lack significant creative power. He needs to show us how all new innovation, structures, body plans, novel information, as I've talked about, can come about, because they cannot be the result of natural selecting acting upon random variation and random mutations. So he's going to have to do better than that, because according to the biblical creation model, obviously species are not static, and neither are their genomes. And when we look to the created heterozygosity hypothesis, we look to change. Obviously, change is important, because those built-in alternatives that we say God put into Adam and Eve, they're scrambled over time, and new traits are going to arise during this process. But he talked a lot about here in my notes, loss of structures, loss of information. And it's funny, because evolutionists will assume that you can just lose it all and eventually you'll gain it all. But that's not going to take your fish to fisherman. And what we actually observe is death, degeneration, and extinction. And at the end of the day, many changes due to mutation, natural selection, they are based on adaptive degeneration, and that's more consistent with the model of biblical creation, because natural selection is not going to be able to stop the loss of information that he even admitted to, the loss of structures that we see in these adaptations, because it's this loss of information, it's immeasurably complex due to low impact mutation accumulation, as I've talked about before, and that's happening on the molecular level. It's like Snake here is trying to fix a computer with the hammer, and that's why I say that evolutionists have to do a lot of imagining. And the changes we see, the adaptations we see based on degeneration, loss of information, that's all consistent with a biblical-based model of death, decay, and obviously degeneration since the fall. So he's going to have to show us an example of a beneficial mutation that actually adds new novel information to the genome, and how a beneficial mutation, which we agree are rare, how that's going to be able to compensate for the net loss of information, because it all comes down to a net loss of information. It looks like his biggest crazy example here, talked about a crime scene and a fossil record. But the thing is, if your inferences are being made, because phylogenetic systematics, for example, it's based on a primary assumption that pawns come to people evolution actually occurred. But if all genetic data points to the death, degeneration of a once perfect genome, that means using fossils as evidence it's just circumstantial evidence, because it doesn't really even have a theory to cling to. And these progressions that he showed in these pictures here, these apparent progressions, are of course predicated on that basic assumption of common descent. And the transitionals that he used, say whales, for example, Pakicetus, Ambulocetus, Rhodocetus, those are highly questionable. And the claim that evolutionists will say that these whale precursors is based mostly on speculation and wishful thinking. That's why I say they hope, they dream, they imagine that mutations are going to make things better. And an honest evaluation of the fossil remains will have anyone believe that. And Pakicetus, for example, formerly assumed to be a fully aquatic mammal, has undergone a drastic revision and is now portrayed as just an ordinary land mammal. And Tiktaalik, for example, the claimed tetrapod traits, they're actually consistent with many living and extinct lobe-fin fish species today. And with the recent discovery as well, and I think Snake's familiar with this, of Poland's tetrapod trackway that actually predates Tiktaalik by nearly 20 million years, the evidence couldn't be any clearer. All Tiktaalik is a bottom-dwelling lobe-fin fish, and it's not the missing link to land animals. The claim that Tiktaalik is this pivotal transitional form involves, like all other transitional forms, speculation, conjecture, and a lot of artistic misrepresentation, as was seen in how long? A minute?
Yes.
As we're seeing in creatures like Pakicetus, for example. Now, let me see here. Paternity tests. I mean, how far do you have to go? I'd like to ask Taylor, was his parents human? Was his grandparents human? How far do you have to go back before they become non-human? I mean, humans are producing humans. He can believe that humans, whales, pine trees, and bacteria are related through common ancestry all he wants, but that's not science. That's not empirical observational science. He's going to have to actually provide us some evidence for that, because that's beyond science. Finches, cats, a boundary. I mean, I've already shown you, based on the model of pre-existing heterozygosity, that God in place these functional DNA differences, which actually makes testable falsifiable predictions in functional DNA, in our junk DNA. And it's actually being shown that the vast majority of our DNA is actually functional. The trajectory of discovery favors genome-wide functionality. And when we look to these functionally unique DNA differences across families, for example, let's say these orphan genes, these taxonomically restricted genes, we can see that common ancestry isn't true. There isn't a universal common ancestry. There clearly is a boundary, and we're going down, not up, based on the accumulation of low impact, near neutral, deleterious mutations. There's no way natural selection can rid the population of these near neutral detrimental mutations. And this is all consistent with the biblical based model. This is why a model of created heterozygosity better explains the speciation, because these are based on a sorting out of information, gene conversion, recombination. But evolution is going to have to explain the net gain of information to go from your fish to fisherman. How much more time do I have there, Matt?
Your time's up.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, Taylor, you ready?
Yeah. Can I screen share again?
Yeah, go ahead. I'll tell you when I see it.
Okay.
Good. There it is.
All right.
All right, and whenever you start, I'll start the timer. 10 minutes.
All right. So I'm going to start off by addressing kind of the mitochondrial Eve and stuff. I'm not really seeing how you are drawing the conclusions that points back to a single common female ancestor, because that's just not. We're gonna discuss that further, because that's not what any of the experts derive from any of that data, and it doesn't really logically follow. Just because we have a common thread in the mitochondrial lineage does not mean that that was the first mitochondria that was ever there. That's a leap in logic. So, and then to loop back to kind of what you were just touching on, the reason Tiktaalik is important is not necessarily to be a particular bridge in fossils. The point is that you guys accept comparative anatomy up until an arbitrary point where you just don't really like it because it goes up against your narrative. So again, I'm going to repeat that the slam dunk argument is really the radiometric dating. So all these different organisms are found in layers that are millions of years old. And we're going to have to discuss, you're going to have to figure out how to overthrow basic chemistry. So let's maybe focus on that in the discussion, because that's the dating is very important, but so is the comparative anatomy. So what I'm talking about is, you said the Tiktaalik is clearly just a lobe-finned fish. How do you know? Because you're comparing its anatomy to other lobe-finned fishes, like the Panderichthys. So you seem to indicate that you think these are the same kind of creature. I think they're the same kind of creature. They look like the same kind of creature to me. What about these two? Seems like the same kind of creature to me. What about these two? It looks the same. The only real difference is the finger bones. That's literally it. What about these two? At any point, are any of these different kinds? If you can't tell us, then you have just proven that there is no boundary between all of these forms, and all of these forms range from a lobe-finned fish to a walking creature. But you can't point out where there's a reasonable boundary between any of them. They're all the same creature, and yet they're all different creatures. That's how evolution works. Slight changes, but not so slight as to be uniformly slight. There are jumps. The finger bones will change in a generation or two. There's not a transition between, well, the finger bones have to move just a centimeter with each generation. It can make a leap, like similarly to this, in just 1 or 2 generations. And that's why we seem to see species pop into the fossil record. And confusingly, creationists use this as a evidence for special creation. But this would only make sense if God was specially creating these species to die extinct as the flood was laying them down layer by layer. So that explanation just doesn't wash at all. What else do I need to address here? So how do we get it's the fish from the fisherman, fish to fisherman? It's just a fundamental misunderstanding of how these incremental changes add up, and a straw man on what incremental means. Um, Fish are already fishermen. There's fish who just go out and eat other fish. There are fish who don't eat other fish. There's that kind of variation. Creationists accept that creation. But it's unclear how many fish kinds that there are, and the fact that you can't define them means that we can't even talk about it. But you say they exist, but you can't define what a kind is. You can't set what boundaries of a kind are, and this goes to prove our point, which is that there is no boundary between the kinds because of universal common descent. And again, just to reiterate the Neanderthal stuff, you guys accept that there is Neanderthal DNA detectable in human DNA. We've never seen this occur. We've never seen a Neanderthal exist ever. Yet you accept on the basis of genetic phylogeny that there is Neanderthal DNA in humans. But you don't accept the same exact process for monkeys and, well, more specifically, the apes, which are so much closer than any other form of life. You say that you just look around at the earth and you say you see obvious design. Well, I look at the apes and the humans and I see obvious similarities. And these same processes, comparative anatomy and descent, molecular phylogeny, these are both used on the short scale by creationists and they accept it. But there's an arbitrary line that they don't like crossed, but they can't even explain or define it. So that's going to be a major problem going forward. You guys like to say that we imagine these transitions, but it's really quite gradual. These, when you lay them out, you don't have to do any imagining, but you guys literally have to invoke magic. And I will just leave off here. I always think this is one of the most poignant images with the mathematician pointing at his work where one of his students has said a miracle occurs here, and he says, I think you should be more explicit here. And I agree. That's not, like, you might be right, but that's not science. Science has an explanation. If science can't explain it, well, maybe you can explain it in a different way. But until you can come up with a better way than science, then you're not going to refute it. How am I doing on time?
You're good. You have 2.5 minutes.
All right. Then you had some questions about what did you say exactly?
He was talking about MTD naive, an atom, Y chromosome atom, low genetic diversity, and 3 haplogroups, and genetic orphan genes.
Well, I know that he said that the Y chromosome was the most robust, and we actually don't see that. The Y chromosome is actually seems to be decaying in a lot of ways. It's one of the least robust chromosomes. And the 3 haplogroups and the 3 wives of Noah just seems kind of like a number 23 kind of situation where you're just seeing the same number somewhere, and just by virtue of kind of numerology, you just assume that they're connected. You were saying something. He said something about just how you can build a genome, and I know we've been over this multiple times. It's all about duplication and then diversification. We know duplications occur, we know mutations occur, and this creates diversifications. And if you have a wide, diverse field of different options, one of them is going to be a good option and is actually going to be better than the option you have right now. even if 100,000 of the others are bad options. So I'm just gonna have to keep drilling this into your guys' heads, I guess. We'll go over the specifics. I'll leave you on a final analogy of remember how I'm sure everyone has played with Legos, and over time your original sets, they'd fall apart and they'd fall into your just general bin of Legos, and you would create all kinds of different custom creations with all these different original pieces. You've never created a new original Lego piece by yourself, but you're creating new combinations that are drastically and completely different from the originals, but using all the exact same building blocks. So I'll end there.
Perfect timing. That was your 10 minutes. That's good. All right, guys, good job. It looks like we are moving into what is it? The cross-examination now. So I believe that's 4 minutes for each. Standing for truth. Are you ready for that?
Yep, I'm ready when you are, brother.
All right, let me stop this, reset my timer, and go ahead whenever you're ready.
Okay, Taylor, so I noticed a big thing with your rebuttal there. You didn't really address anything from my opening statement. So I said that it's too close for comfort for evolutionists, because the data that I was talking about is not even disputed by evolutionists. Just look at the evolutionary literature. They all agree that mitochondrial DNA falls within 3 major haplogroups. So it's not just a guess. So how do you explain away? And how do you explain within an evolutionary worldview, the low genetic diversity, the fact that we have one Y chromosomal male ancestor, one mitochondrial female ancestor, the fact that most genes come in 2 versions, the fact that all people seem to be closely related, there's only a few mitochondrial DNA lines, the one Y chromosome line, and evidence of rapid population growth. These were all points that I made in detail in my opening. How do you explain all that? And then how do you explain it in a evolutionary worldview? Go ahead.
Yeah, the supporters of evolution don't really interpret it how the creationists do. But there are certain genes, and those genes do exist in the mitochondrial and the sex chromosomes, that are highly conserved, which means they don't change because they're very useful the way they are. So the Hox genes, for example, don't change a lot either. And there is the universal common ancestor is a lot further back in the phylogenetic tree to compare it with the mtDNA that you're talking about in that sense. But it's the same thing, basically.
Well, no, because, for one, the first thing that I started out with low genetic diversity, according to the biblical base model, we all come from just 2 people. So that obviously means that limited diversity that we actually see is easy to explain. But if we started off with millions of people, you're going to have a lot of, genes floating around a population of 1 million strong. But if you only start off with 2 people, Adam and Eve, like I said, that restricts the diversity today. So how do you, under the assumption of evolution, in the evolutionary paradigm, how do you explain that? I mean, this seems to be a prediction more strongly made under a biblical-based model and a literal interpretation of Genesis. So how do you explain the low genetic diversity? Like, is it the bottleneck that you guys look to?
It's just something that's highly conserved in the population. So there's no reason to change it. There's no other alleles that have really picked up and fixed in the population.
But
there's other genes that do have alleles, and some genes don't have other alleles.
Right.
And that's just the way it is.
Are you denying the fact that the evolutionary community resorts to a near extinction event in the past that was that they refer to as a bottleneck to explain the low genetic diversity? Are you not aware of that, or?
That could easily explain it.
Okay, but the thing is that explanation, that story would cause permanent and severe genetic damage, because enormous numbers of deleterious mutations would obviously go to fixation. So how could such a tiny, nearly extinct obviously genetically compromised population, according to the evolutionary story, suddenly explode into all parts of the planet. Obviously, it seems like, once again, if this is all about whose model is stronger, isn't it just a rescue device, this evolutionary bottleneck hypothesis? Isn't it? It doesn't seem like it's feasible. So how do you explain away the major flaws in that rescue device? Go ahead.
That'll have to be your last question because of time soon.
Well, I don't think you pointed out any flaws in it, because the bottleneck is thought to be about 10,000 individuals, and there are multiple studies, some of which you've cited, which show that they've run the numbers, and about population sizes smaller than about 1,000 are vulnerable to mutational meltdown via accumulation of slightly deleterious mutations. But the bottleneck is thought to have been about 10 times higher than that. So.
All right, Snake, you're up then. It's your 4 minutes.
Okay. So I really wanted to drill you about, how do you know that there's Neanderthal DNA in humans?
How do we? Through gene sequencing. We know that there's Neanderthal DNA in humans. I think it's up to 20%. I think, if my memory serves me right.
So how come you don't accept that exact same process between apes and humans?
Because the thing is, Neanderthals are shown and demonstrated to be 100% human. Just a subgroup of humans that went extinct due to inbred effects and high genetic load. I mean, we know for a fact that they are 40% less fit than modern humans today, and there's no reason to suggest that we share relationship with apes.
Well, you accept that we share a relationship with Neanderthals based on comparative genetics, but you don't accept relationship based on comparative genetics with apes. So what is the difference between Neanderthals and humans? Because if they went extinct before us, surely there's a difference in the rate of mutation, right?
Right, but are you familiar, like, how much because if you actually look at the percentage difference between Neanderthals and humans versus, say, are you familiar with the fact that human to chimpanzee genetic identity is no longer known to be 98 to 99% similar? It's actually more so 88% similar. And based on the fact that the Y chromosome is so vastly different between a chimp and a human, completely destroys the idea that we're related through common ancestry with chimpanzees. So that discrepancy is not found between humans and Neanderthals. So that would be a pretty sufficient answer, I believe.
Well, I mean, are you aware that it's not really about the total number of genes? It's about which genes are uniquely conserved. Like, that's
Right. But I'm saying that when they actually selected the data being used to compare the sequences, they only used sequences that they expected to be similar. They didn't actually include non-aligned DNA gaps, copy number variation, size differences. So 88% different, regardless of the conserved areas, destroys the idea that apes and humans are related through common ancestry. Plus the Y chromosome. I mean, based on the recombination rates in the Y chromosome, I mean, I don't know how you're going to convince me that we share relationship if all humans are so similar with their Y chromosome, but yet so vastly different with apes.
so. If Neanderthals went extinct before us due to mutational load, how have we managed to slow down that mutation accumulation?
The thing is, Neanderthals, because inbreeding exposes the hidden reservoir of genetic mistakes. So they're going to go extinct quicker based on genetic degeneration and the accumulation of near neutral mutations. But we do see entropic degeneration on all levels, right? Cancers, autoimmune diseases, autism is on the rise. We see thousands and thousands of new mutation-related diseases being added to the database yearly. So obviously we're going to be more resistant because we're not all inbred subpopulations such as the Neanderthals. But that's why they went extinct quick, just like the mammoth populations went extinct as well due to genetic entropy. They were inbred.
So can you point to the mechanism for mutation, because you believe that life forms predate, you believe the DNA mechanisms, machineries, all predate mutation, because you believe mutation was a part of the fall that was given to life as the price for sin. So can you point to what do you believe is driving and causing mutations?
That'll have to be your last question. That'll be time for you as well.
Well, I believe that Adam and Eve were created with pre-existing functional DNA differences. So evolutionists assume that all DNA differences are due to mutation. I only believe that based on the hypothesis of created heterozygosity, created pre-existing functional DNA differences, that only a small amount of these differences are due to mutations. They're like typographical errors in a text. They're mistakes in our genetic code. And we've accumulated mutations since the fall, but not all DNA. I'm not sure if you think that all DNA differences are based on mutations. Our model says that the majority of them are actually based on inbuilt alternatives that God put into Adam and Eve. That's why we say when they're scrambled over time, new traits are going to arise during this process. Shifts from heterozygosity to homozygosity is going to lead to new species. Not even based on mutations, though, based on gene conversion and recombination. So,
well, the question is more about why mutations exist, like what is driving them to happen, I guess.
What is driving them to happen? They're just genetic mistakes that occur in our in our genome. Obviously, there's epigenetic mutation as well, and environmental factors. Whenever the DNA is copied, it's copied imperfectly. So we're going to get these mistakes, and that's why we inherit a multitude of old mutations. We start adding new mutations at the first division of our zygote, and we even die primarily due to mutation accumulation. So isn't that how you assume mutations are derived as well? Just genetic?
Well, not quite. I'm just confused as what do you think the difference is between a pre-fall genetic code and a current mutatable genetic code? Because as far as we understand, mutations occur because of well, like you said, the errors in the assembly of the genetic code, but that occurs specifically because of the physics of the actual chemicals. They have to they're rotating and flying all over the place. They have to be in exact rotation in the exact right position. It's almost like space docking. And so if anything goes wrong, then it can just fly off and an error can occur. And that's essentially where the errors come from. So the heart of the question, we can get on to the next phase, but is really about what's the difference there.
We do have 5 minutes closing. Did you want to just answer that, Standing, or do you want to add that to your closing statement?
I can add it. I think I get what he's saying. I can add it to my closing statement, of course.
Okay. Whenever you're ready, then let me just know, and I'll start the timer.
Awesome. Well, I want to first start with obviously my opening and how I don't believe he addressed all the evidence that I provided in genetics, and our model in regards to the three major haplogroups makes testable and falsifiable predictions, because this tree that I showed on the screen, you know, it contains a stamp in the history of civilization, and these predictions have already been confirmed. And the thing is, Dr. Jensen, he's rooted the tree on the L node, and the evolutionists, they're going to have to give justification for where they put their root. And it's all about the testable predictions that flow from the placement of the root. But even the evolutionary community understands the fact that mitochondrial DNA does go into three major haplogroups. So at the end of the day, you know, there have been testable predictions being made, and we've chosen the base of the L root in this tree as one of the wives of Noah's sons, with the bases of M and N as the wives of the other two sons. And the rooting works because it leads to accurate predictions and retrodictions about the rate of mitochondrial DNA mutations. So at the end of the day, we're making testable, falsifiable predictions. The evolutionists are going to have to follow suit in regards to that. He talked about molecular phylogenetics, but the thing is, we do look to phylogenetic systematics, but to differentiate between the models, we're going to have to look at competing hypotheses. And the thing is, this phylogenetic systematics is based a lot on the outdated concept of junk DNA, and DNA functions are now beginning to be found more and more every single day. Meaning we understand less than obviously 5% of the DNA language. And as I've said before, the trajectory strongly suggests that the vast majority of DNA is going to be functional. And if the vast majority of DNA is functional, and we've made that prediction based on created heterozygosity, then it becomes a common design argument, as we have always predicted. And they build their molecular phylogenetic trees and build their nested hierarchies based on an assumption that the majority of our DNA differences are based on mutation. And the thing is, the best evidence that evolutionists could offer have all been overturned. For example, these shared genetic mistakes that they use in their phylogenetic trees, they've been overturned. These pseudogenes are now known to be functional DNA elements and not actually mistakes. And we've only really just begun to discover, as I said, how functional the human genome is. And it's mind-boggling how many experiments would actually be required to conclude with any level of confidence that a particular set of DNA sequences has absolutely no function. And many of these non-coding RNA genes, say the pseudogenes, are only expressed under certain conditions. And a lot of these genetic markers that they'll use in their molecular phylogenetic trees and their inferences have been overturned as well. For example, the beta globin pseudogene, another pseudogene that was said to be the broken remnants of an ancient chicken gene. These are all now known to be functional DNA elements, all consistent with a model of creation and common design. So that's how we're going to be able to differentiate between the two models. I've went over orphan genes, taxonomically restricted genes that we can use to in our gene sequencing to see what's related and what's not. And he asks, you know, what's the barrier? You know, there's, I believe, 8 types of bears. You know, what's the limit? You know, there's the panda bear, the polar bear, the brown bear, the Asian black bear, the American black bear. The limit, I think, is bear. What we see here, the evidence he's provided by no means demonstrates that bears, bacteria, whales, and pine trees are related through common ancestry. What we see are limits. We see a barrier. We see taxonomically restricted genes such as orphan genes. And the fact is, genomes are devolving and the genome is rusting out like a car. Things are going down, not up. This is all consistent with my model. And if it's about the origin of species, the model of created heterozygosity, as I've demonstrated here, makes testable and falsifiable predictions on all types of genetic related evidence. And all modern scientific evidence points to the decay and destruction of an originally perfect design and creation. So he's still going to have to provide us some beneficial mutations that are not deleterious by any means to be able to counterbalance the influx of deleterious mutations. They're pouring in faster than can be removed. If you're going to start off as a single-celled organism, multi-celled organism, fish, amphibian, reptile, mammal, bird, monkey, man, I mean, phenomenal increases in expansion of genetic information is going to be required. So I've seen really his best evidence that he believes is fossils. And as I've demonstrated, it's circumstantial evidence requiring an actual theory to explain the data. And if you want to look at fossils in general, I mean, nobody disagrees that there is strong evidence that the Earth was once underwater. There's marine fossils on mountains and in landlocked areas that are actually far from the sea. Some sedimentary rock layers extend over entire continents or even farther. And the deposition of those layers must have been catastrophic, but there would not have been much fossilization. I mean, how many animals died today and how many fossilized? There are fossils of animals giving birth, fish being eaten. So that suggests sudden and rapid burial. All the evidence points to, in geology and in genetics, points to a biblical-based model. Thanks so much, Matt.
Yeah. All right, Snake, your 5 minutes is good to go. You can go a little over.
Okay. So I don't think he's addressed radiometric dating at all, or even attempted to falsify that. I think he said a little bit about. So I forget. We're gonna have to get into that in detail, but the radiometric dating is consistent and very well established, and all chemists agree. And this disproves the young Earth creationist timeline outright. Now, as for their model of change, that is evolution. So they're kind of in this position where they're needing to move the goalposts back. They've really admitted evolution. They're just trying to say that the created kinds are different. The young Earth creationists have already admitted the main premises of phylogenetics, specifically, which are comparative anatomy and molecular genetic comparison, for what they view as reasonably close relations, but they just put up arbitrary walls and constraints on this process, despite admitting that they can't actually tell which organisms are which kinds when presented with like transitional forms, for example. And this indicates that they have no idea what these barriers to evolution actually are, even though they insist that these barriers exist. As he said, the limit is bare. So, sorry, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, I've always been able to. You sound clear.
Oh, my mic light's off.
Strange. I hear you fine.
Okay, just checking. Where was I? The limit would be bare, but I can show you forms that you have no idea how to classify, or a form that can fit into two different kinds or its own kind. I can show you forms that are almost a bear, or kind of sort of a bear, but also a dog. So the rescue device for this is the slightly deleterious mutation accumulation, which puts a time limit on the amount of diversification that can occur. So they assume basically that we just don't have time to differentiate enough to evolve out of our kinds. So again, I really like to hit on this Neanderthal thing, because if they went extinct before us, that means that we have different mutation rates, or a different mutation accumulation rates at least. And this indicates that there are processes that are working against the accumulation of deleterious mutations, and we actually study this. And so I'm going to read from the literature. Negative or purifying selection prevents the unlimited accumulation of deleterious mutations and establishes a mutation selection equilibrium. Overlaying the mutation burden distributions with Poisson distributions have identical means shown that the underdispersion is due to a depletion of individuals with a high number of deleterious alleles. Only about 10% or fewer of mutations seem to behave as slightly deleterious mutations. A deleterious mutation can be compensated by about 9 different intragenic compensatory mutations. Deleterious mutations that were more severe were significantly more likely to be compensated for. And then the final citation I'll read out is our results clearly show that tyrosine alpha 42 asparagine replacement can substantially compensate for the functional defect of HB Kempsey caused by asparagine beta 99 substitution. This paper is entitled Restoring Allosterism with Compensatory Mutations in Hemoglobin. And so essentially, the hemoglobin had lost its ability to, allosterism is basically the ability to accept and change conformation based on a substrate or something that it's binding to. In the case of hemoglobin, that would be oxygen. So we had a mutation that reduced the fitness of hemoglobin, and we had another mutation that restored the functionality of that hemoglobin. So, and we have a lot of evidence that these compensatory mutations occur very often. So that line of logic doesn't really work among scientists. And just circling back to the kinds thing, the thing is that if you can't define it, we can't really talk about it. And we're kind of talking past each other because of this. But you're claiming to have the better explanation, but you can't even define what you're talking about. And thus you're demonstrating my exact argument better than I ever could, because you're showing everyone that there are these hazy gray areas where you can say that because something looks similar, that they are the same kind, and that there are these kinds that we can't classify. And the final thing that I think is really interesting is that they believe in a pre-fall life. Life was alive before the fall, and they believe the fall is the mechanism of the fall is mutation, and thus accumulation of the mutations is the mechanism, and thus mutation is the prerequisite. So either mutations began at the fall or accumulation of mutations began at the fall. And I'm interested in what they think other than magic is going on there, because mutations are just the natural result of the physics of molecules. So I'm wondering what was going on either post-flood or pre-flood that is some kind of divine intervention, keeping mutations from happening, or God introduced mutations, and what specific mechanisms he used to do that, because we can study the specific mechanisms he supposedly used to proliferate life. And that leads me to probably my final thought of this design that's supposedly so obvious, but no one ever uses the sand on the beach as the example to point to design. Everyone points to the watch. And I think people misunderstand and go for complexity. What I'm really looking at when I'm looking for design is intent. And I think you said something about the purpose of humankind when you were in your very first opening. And other than our self-appointed purposes, I'm not seeing any purpose to our design. What purpose are we giving to the designer? Of course, we do have our own moral purposes and everything like that, but
Time.
okay.
Good. All right. I'm sure that you will address each other's questions in that. if you wanted to write them down in our private chat up here for each other. But until that time, I have questions from the audience to ask you guys. If anyone would like to go first, let me know. And
when could I bring in the other guy, Outbound Man?
Well, it'll after this, like this is the formal debate. If we do an after show, then we can do a separate video. So Raw Matt here is going to end like the formal debate with a quick question and answer from the audience.
All right.
All right, great. Okay, for Snake then, what are your thoughts on orthogenesis, or the idea that evolution has a goal in mind, such as humans are the ultimate end goal for evolution? Do you know anything about this, or?
Yeah, it's an interesting thought. I mean, it's not necessarily incompatible with the scientific view of evolution. Could be aliens, could be God doing it. I think that's kind of the theistic view of evolution.
Great. All right. One was from Genesis Girl asking you again, Snake, if you could present any papers that could cite or would show a series of maybe, say, 6 beneficial mutational steps that show accumulating or coordinating.
You want a series of 6 steps?
6 was just arbitrary.
Like I can give you 6 beneficial mutations. Message me and I'll give you details, but I'll go. I mean, how much in detail do you want me to go in this? Because I have details.
It's sadly limited to 200 letters, so I doubt questions can be detailed.
So that thing that I was just the last citation that I read out about the restoring allosterism with compensatory mutations in hemoglobin. So that was a series of mutations that was just 2, I believe. It was a replacement mutation that caused a loss of allosterism in hemoglobin, and then there was a separate compensatory mutation which restored it through a different process. I don't know if she wants like a whole series of 6 steps or just several examples of these mutations. There's all kinds of mutations that diseases undergo. The flu goes under mutations constantly every year. And they're different mutations. Essentially, they're coded with proteins, and they change those all the time. And the insides don't change, but the outside changes all the time. So our immune systems can't keep up with it as efficiently.
Okay.
If she wants to message me, email me at thesnakewasright@gmail.com, and we can go into like super fine detail. But let's keep the questions rolling.
Okay, great. The next one would be from, I believe it was Landon. He said, how can evolution so precisely result in convergence between marsupials and placental mammals? He presumed that even one instance would be seemingly unlikely. Can you give?
Of what traits, though? Like, it's kind of hard to answer that question.
Yeah, he didn't really mention that.
Yeah. Maybe he just post in the live chat, Landon, to clarify what traits you think are a convergent evolution, and then we can get back to it.
Yeah, okay. And then I guess the last one for you then would be, how can evolution be true science if natural chemistry cannot produce, I think, D-ribose, the backbone of DNA and RNA? So it looks like it's a abiogenesis question.
Yeah, I mean, most people probably know my answer. That's not evolution. That's abiogenesis. Evolution assumes that there's already a working cellular mechanism and just studies the change in generations after breeding. And there is no scientific consensus on how uh, the working genome was first assembled. We know there's a lot of data and experiments on a lot of different steps and parts, but there is no unified theory yet.
Got it. Got it. I'm not sure where he's going with this one as well, but this one is from Nephilim Free. He asks, since DNA polymerase iOS is a product of its own translation, how is it possible for evolution to be true?
I mean, that's the same kind of question. We assume that a lot of these basic cellular components pre-exist.
And I see Landon replied to you in the comment section. He said, for example, there are marsupial moles, marsupial rats, marsupial saber-tooth tigers. They correspond to their placental counterparts.
Oh, so how multiple different mammals evolved like marsupial traits, I think. How does, I mean, I guess he's just asking me to explain convergent evolution. So there's a process called carcinization or carcin. I think that's what it is.
A carcinogen, a cancer-causing element, or?
No, it's related to crabs. So it's a process by which animals come to appear to look like crabs that aren't actually crabs. And this has been observed as such a common pattern that they've actually given it a name. And the names are similar because the crab Cancer was the ancient name for the crab constellation or something. So it's called carcinization. I'll look it up real quick.
Okay.
But all kinds of animals will develop the traits of a crab, like claws and stuff. Like, yeah, carcinization. And this is because these particular traits are useful. So they will tend to pile up in any kind of life form that has the possibility or variance, which includes this form. And since these forms are successful, they're going to be found repeated. So it's kind of the same thing with flight. Yeah.
All right. Great. Well, that was our 10 minutes. So standing for truth's time. And if you wanted to close with anything, Taylor, I'll let you. Before we, of course, get into our closing statements.
No, we already did that. Matt, we already did the closing statements. You just got to ask my questions now.
I got you. Okay. All right, great.
Yeah.
Okay, standing for truth. First one comes from, looks like the Mott Way. He asked, what is the mechanism for heterozygosity?
So our created heterozygosity hypothesis directly answers Taylor's question on created kind. So I'm not sure if he just misunderstands the model, but evolutionists assume that, the vast majority or all of the DNA differences, nuclear DNA differences, mitochondrial DNA differences, are based on mutation. Now, I always ask people, do you believe that God intended his command to be fruitful and multiply to be by cloning? And the answer 9 times out of 10 is no. And what they've done is they've acknowledge a very particular and specific genetic view. And that view is that God created Adam and Eve with functional pre-existing DNA differences within themselves. And that's universal across species as well, the created kind. So with this amazing design and functional heterozygosity, and he's asking, what the mechanism is. Well, the mechanism obviously was God encoded Adam, Eve, and the created kinds with these inbuilt alternatives. But we wouldn't just look to mutations to provide the variety. We look to processes like gene conversion and recombination. That way, an essentially unlimited range of useful diversity would actually be produced. And the thing is, this hypothesis makes testable, falsifiable predictions. And that's how we answer the question of, what's related and what's not. Because you got different views. You got the fixity of species that, you know, creationists 100 years ago looked to, and then you got evolutionists that just believe everything's related, and you got us in the middle that believes in limited ancestry. But that's why I was confused. He didn't answer or address anything that I said on the taxonomically restricted functional genes known as orphan genes, which actually demonstrates limited ancestry, which actually demonstrates a barrier and demonstrates created kind. So he didn't address it as far as I recall. Now, obviously, we have to do further DNA testing, and that's why the model created heterozygosity makes these testable and falsifiable predictions, such as you know, we'd expect that most non-coding DNA is going to be functional. Obviously, if God encoded the created kinds, Adam and Eve, with functional DNA differences, well, the vast majority of DNA should be functional. That would confirm our model. Also, differences in mitochondrial DNA sequences, say, between families are expected to reflect functional differences, not just be due to neutral mutations, and that would confirm a model of created kinds. Also, measured mitochondrial DNA mutation rates and known mitochondrial DNA differences within families are then expected to fit the creation timescale, and we assume a constant mutation rate, and created kinds started with obviously no mitochondrial DNA mutation. So slowly but surely, the more we understand the DNA language, we're understanding what's related and what's not related. And orphan genes, for example, are a way to understand that there is limited ancestry, because there is no ancestry seen in these specific taxonomically restricted genes known as orphan genes. So I just wanted to clear up a few things, but I think that answers his question sufficiently.
Yeah, sure. No problem. Your next one is going to be, what do you hope to change with these in these science debates? Like, what do you hope to change in science, actually, from these debates online?
Well, I think the fact that you know, the biblical creation model is now making testable and falsifiable predictions that we can go test in the lab, and so far what's being discovered and what's being confirmed is more consistent with our models. For example, based on LMN haplogroups, mitochondrial DNA mutation rates, the fact that the UN database tells us that African people statistically married sooner, which we can assume they reproduce sooner. And we've made predictions on the Khoisan peoples, which actually their mutation rates haven't been measured yet. So we've made the predictions. The evolutionists haven't made the predictions. So maybe they need to put that on paper, and we'll see which model is stronger. So I'd like to show and increase the faith of our fellow believers, as well as make unbelievers understand that they can be confident in the Bible, know that the Bible's true. I'm not necessarily trying to change the science of our day, because the Bible tells us that things are only going to get worse. In the last days, there's going to be scoffers denying three things, which are going to be the creation, the flood, you know, the global flood, and the coming judgment of Jesus Christ. So atheism is going to die, because the Antichrist, we know, is not an atheist. He will declare himself to be God. So atheism is temporary. I don't expect to change any militant atheist minds, and I don't expect to change the science of our days, given what the Bible teaches us about the last days. So I hope that answers his question.
Yeah, that was good. And the next one would be, can we tell a difference between created genes and new mutated ones? Since the Earth is only 6,000 years old in your model, it should be easy, he said. I didn't write down who asked that, though.
I think if we look at, well, if you looked at, say, the gulo pseudogene, we know the surrounding regions are drunk or highly mutated. So we would know that that's obviously a mutated genes, and more mutated genes are often found in regions where their counterparts, say like promoter regions, are mutated as well. But highly mutated genes are often in very junk related region. So I'd say the ones that don't correlate with that data, like I know the HapMap project shows that there are more mutated genes than less mutated genes, and those less mutated ones are can be determined through the hap map. So it's a good question, because obviously he's looking further into the model of created heterozygosity, but something that is functional and something that doesn't correlate with these surrounding regions that we can infer highly mutated would be probably a way to understand what's a created functional DNA difference and what's actually not. That's why we need to test. That's why the gold standard of gene functional testing is gene knockout tests, and those haven't been performed on mammals. Obviously, it's unethical. So at this moment, we understand less than 5% of the DNA language, but in time, I suspect that the biblical-based model will be confirmed more and more.
All right. Another question would be, what would convince you of an old Earth creation model? For example, what kind of evidence would be required for you to convert your way of thinking?
Well, for one, my starting point is the Bible. We know in 2 Peter 3 that people are going to deny a global flood, and the thing is, the global flood is actually what explains all the geology. So if you're going to look to the radio, all the dating methods, for example, and I did address that. I think it was the first thing I addressed in my rebuttal period. But the thing is, those assumptions are now going to be false because of a global model. And the thing is, if you want an example, say, of just a small scale example of what a global flood would be like, and how much it does explain all the geology. I mean, just look at the eruption at Mount St. Helens. I mean, that alone demonstrated that sedimentary layers hundreds of feet thick could be laid down in hours to days. So you'd have to show me, for one, from the Bible, and you'd also have to show me, because the thing is, based on mutations, which are the driving force of evolution, that pawns come to people type evolution, that mutations are destruction, not construction. And if you can show me how these genomes don't have limited shelf lives based on the accumulation of near neutral mutations scientifically, I may have to look at the Bible and take a alternative hermeneutical approach. But the thing is, the Bible in no way, shape, or form describes an old Earth, describes evolutionary theory. And if you can explain to me 2 Peter 3 any other way than somebody in the last day denying the global flood, which explains the geology and everything we see that makes evolutionists believe the Earth is old, well, then I might have to rethink it. But that's a good question, kind of a tough question, but that's the best answer I got.
Yeah, and your last one comes from Neff. He says, "Does cheese exist?"
Cheese exists. I had pizza today for lunch at work, and I can tell you for a fact, cheese exists, and cheese is good.
There it is. There it is, Neff. Most important question of the night answered. All right, guys. Good job. This one is over for tonight, and I got every question down that everybody asked. They can a lot of abiogenesis going on in the chat for the last hour, but no questions about it for you guys. So I guess that could be another debate sometime.
Well, I appreciate it, Matt. You did a great job moderating. Taylor, thanks for joining us for another debate. I think it was enjoyable, profitable. Hope the audience enjoyed. We'll end it here. We'll discuss an after show in our email and in our chat. And as for now, thanks a lot, guys. Standing for Truth is out.